Welcome back to the Cream City Club podcast. I am Spencer Michaelis, and I'm here again with Gunnar Amelung. Gunnar, we just finished recording a little bit of a Bucks episode, so I know how you're doing, so I'm not going to ask you that again. But for the listeners out there, if you are listening and you haven't yet subscribed, please take a moment to do that on whatever platform you're listening on. And if you're so inclined to rate us 5 stars, that would be super helpful moving forward. This episode, we will be focusing on the Brewers. We, as I mentioned, also recorded a Bucks episode today. So if you're looking for that, be sure to check out the other episode that was released at the same time today. So, Gunnar, I think we'll just jump right into what was a surprisingly busy 4 days for the Brewers after we had that. We have a real long episode with Jack Stern that came out on Wednesday, if you haven't, or on Thursday, I should say. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, we went into a lot of what has already happened this offseason and gave a little bit of a preview. But there were a few more moves that have happened since we recorded that one. So we wanted to get together again and talk about that. So, regarding those transactions that have happened since we last spoke, let's start with the biggest one of all of them and kind of the most unfortunate one of all of them, and that is that Brandon Woodruff and the Brewers were unable to reach an agreement on a new deal, resulting in Woodruff being non-tendered. So, Gunnar, what were you expecting to happen in that situation? What were you hoping would happen? Were you surprised at all with what happened?
Yeah, it just seems like we can't avoid sad news as Brewer fans. But I wasn't very surprised. Um, I think this became more of a realistic possibility once we found out about that injury. Obviously, we didn't even probably second guess it if he never had that injury. I mean, we wouldn't even be sitting here talking about it
No,
probably.
he'd be back.
Yeah, and ideally, I think he would have liked to have found a trade or um, worked out some 2-year deal that was favorable for us. But guess what? We probably did try to do that, and there's a reason why that wasn't a possibility. I think the problem is, and sort of the Brewers' angle of it is, you're banking on him not only. Let's say you do kind of stretch the bank a little bit, and you bring him back just because of what he's been and what he's meant to us. You're not only banking on him coming back. Well, first you're banking on him coming back to being Brandon Woodruff in a year from now, and you're just punting 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 plus $1 million this next season. Just that's going to nobody because he's obviously not playing next year. And then, like I said, that's with the guarantee potentially of that, oh, he's going to come back the year after and he's going to be Brandon Woodruff and he's going to be the horse at the top of the rotation that we've had. But um, that's obviously a risk that we probably can't afford to take. Um, we've heard since he's been non-tendered that he had a lot of interest. I think that what that ties into is I think the Brewers knew that we weren't going to do what I just said we were going to do, and we weren't going to pay him more than what he probably deserved in our eyes. So then people were just like, well, why are we going to give you a prospect or a couple guys to help you out if we know that he's going to be non-tendered and we can just have a chance to overpay him ourselves? So um, it's just tough for me, I think, knowing how much he's meant to the Brewers. And we talked a little bit how it kind of felt like an end of an era a little bit with Craig leaving. And I think now to me, this has really just kind of put a staple in it. It just feels like a whole new, and not necessarily in a bad way, but it doesn't have to be. But it does kind of feel like a closing of the door of, I was just kind of tied to that. The beginning of it was that 2017, 2018, obviously run that we had.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, we can sit here talking about the memories of 2018. That home run that he had obviously is ingrained into our brains at this point. But um, I think emotionally for me, it's obviously tough just for all that reason. Um, we've heard all the great stories about him on Twitter and throughout the years. Just knowing him, he just seems like a great clubhouse guy and the honestly the perfect baseball player as far as a person goes to have in the clubhouse. But yeah, I mean, if there, and I will end it with this. We've talked about a little bit. Um, for guys, if there was ever a 1 game playoff at any point in a Brewers game history, I would want Brandon Woodruff pitching that game.
Yep.
Um, he's obviously an amazing pitcher in itself, but I think not that I this is where I kind of get a little coachy on when I think of this type of stuff where I just think he's kind of got that dog in him too, where we've seen Corbin Burns and stuff, which I'll get to later, is he hasn't necessarily performed in those bigger moments. But we've always seen Brandon Woodruff step up and um just give us a chance to win every single time. So that's the type of guy that I'd want on the mound. Um and then knowing everything else about him as I laid out, it stings a lot and um those memories don't have to go away, obviously, that he's leaving, and maybe we do somehow bring him back. I guess you never know, but with the amount of interest out there, it's kind of highly unlikely. Um, but yeah, I guess were you surprised at all? I know you've probably talked about it at length at this point, but what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I was really hoping leading up to it that they'd be able to find a way to make a 2-year deal work. But I also knew that it was probably going to be unlikely for a lot of the reasons you just touched on. First of all, we got to talk about the injury, which I don't like talking about it in these terms, but this is an injury that pitchers not only don't, it takes a while to come back from, but in a lot of cases, they don't come back from. Like, this is an injury that can end careers. It has ended careers, or it has drastically changed careers. Um, the only person I can find while doing research that has come back and been better, or at least as good, is Julio Urias, and he had that surgery when he was 20 years old, not when he was 31. So he had it as a prospect pretty much, where he still had a lot of development going on with his body in terms of like strength and everything. Woodruff's pretty maxed out, and it's harder to rehab stuff the older you get. And it's a terrible. Right now, my goal and hope for Woodruff is that he pitches in MLB again. And if he does, I'm going to be thrilled for the guy for all the reasons you touched on. I think I tweeted this the day he got non-tendered, but if there was any Brewer player in my entire life that I would want, if I could pick somebody I really wanted to be teammates with, it would be Brandon Woodruff. Just the way he attacks the game. Like you said, he does have like a bulldog mentality on the mound. Like, his stuff is not as good as Corbin Burns, but I guarantee you he thinks it is. When he goes out there, he thinks he can get anybody out at any time, and he just attacks. And I love pitchers who treat baseball that way. Like, just you put in all this work to get here, go out and attack and trust what you've done. And he did that at all times. Like we talked about the big moments, he was just always stepping up in them. The home run is the moment people remember, but that entire playoff series, I mean, he was a rookie and he just kept getting outs and he kept coming in. And I mean, we had the Miley experiment when he pitched to one batter, and everybody says the Brewers broke baseball by doing something that teams were doing with an opener already. But Woodruff's just, that was a hard day for me. Like, I don't normally get too much. Like, Ryan Braun retiring, like, that was a really hard day. Watching Prince Fielder's press conference when he had to retire because of the neck thing, like, that was a really hard day. When Brewers leave the organization, it's usually like, man, all right, that sucks. Those were good players. Like, it's too bad to lose them. But that Woodruff news hitting it was really, really hard to hear. And I feel bad for him. Like you said, the Brewers absolutely tried to look into all the other options they could to either keep him around or to make a trade that was worthwhile. And Ken Rosenthal reported that they had some offers on the table in trades, but they were there was nothing of substance to them. And the Brewers said, we would rather let Woodruff find some place that he's comfortable with than to take a deal where we're just getting kind of a flyer and see what happens. Like, they tried to do right by Woodruff. I know a lot of people were upset by this happening. I tweeted this out too. I don't understand what we wanted to happen here. Like, what were the Brewers supposed to do? It was a terrible situation to be in. And I guarantee you, they did not want to do what they did. They did not want to have to non-tender Brandon Woodruff. I mean, think about the statement they put out there on their social medias about a guy they just non-tendered. Like, that was a heartfelt message from Matt Arnold about a guy he
Mm-hmm.
just non-tendered. Like, that doesn't happen. You don't ever see that. And they did not want to do what they did, but they knew it was kind of the only option at some point. And like Gunnar touched on, it Woodruff right now should go out and try and find the absolute most guaranteed money he can find, because he might not ever have a chance to get that money again. And you cannot blame him for saying no to a 2-year deal that the Brewers offered that they felt comfortable with. If he can go out and go get more money, he should absolutely do that. So yeah, he meant a ton to the Brewers organization, and I am going to miss
Hmm.
him more than most. I know Arnold didn't close the door on it, there being a return in the end, so I'm not going to get my hopes up too much, but it would be pretty cool if at some point Woodruff wears a Brewers jersey again. I think that would be a very, very fun moment just to see him out there at least one more time in a Brewers uniform. So,
Yeah.
you have any other thoughts on Woody?
No, I mean, for me, it's just going to be about now, where are we, what are we left with now? Because
Yeah,
no, it wasn't necessarily surprising in the moment currently right now, but we're going to obviously touch on guys like Corbin Burns
yeah,
potentially being traded, but with those two guys now, it's just we were penciled in three ace like type guys in our rotation, and now you just potentially remove two of them.
yeah.
Uh, so I guess in your expert opinion, uh, where do you think we should look to find? We don't necessarily, in my opinion, need those types of players, but as far as I mean, if we're talking about MLB the Show type of rating guys, 90 plus rating guys, the top of the rotation, but um, that those are two big holes now in the rotation. Where
Yeah,
do we find guys to replace that?
yeah. And we talked about it with Jack a little bit, but even Wade Miley's, he was pitching above what he was actually capable of as a pitcher, but he was putting up really good results. And that's another arm that might be gone from this past year's rotation. So with Woodruff, I mean, we'll touch on Burns and the potential for trade later, but even let's say we do have Burns in the rotation. First of all, the Colin Ray signing is already looking really like a really smart move. I mean, you look at what Lance Lynn got from the Cardinals after a very bad season. He was not good last year, and he is an aging guy who is very reliant on a four-seam fastball. Just I can't imagine that's going to work out very well. The Cardinals don't seem to have their devil magic as much going on anymore, knock on wood. So hopefully they don't just find that back and get him back into his prime. But I think they're going to look for depth. I think if they go out and they find, let's say they go out and they look for even a Luis Severino type guy who I could see potentially signing like a 1-year deal because he is trying to have a prove it type of season. If you're in Severino's position, there's not many better organizations to try and take that chance with on a 1-year deal, because the Brewers have proven that they can put you in a really good position to succeed and then potentially go out and make your money the next year. But I could see them going that type of route with somebody who is kind of proven, but also looking for a 1-year type of prove it deal. I think Robert Gasser is going to make the opening day starting rotation currently. I think they'd probably have to add multiple guys for him to not make the opening day rotation. So there's some internal options. You could even, I know people weren't thrilled with what they saw out of Jansen Junk when he first came up, but he's a possibility to at least help with innings. There are some other guys within the probably a little young. Carlos Rodriguez is probably not an opening day type guy, but I could see him making starts for the Brewers at some point. And just think about what they've been able to find in different years. Like Gio Gonzalez comes back in 2019 after helping out a more like a pen role in 2018 and makes a ton of starts. I mean, Ulysse Chassin was a cheap signing that made a ton of starts and had a really good time. Wade Miley was a minor league signing the first time he came here and was super important to that run. Julio Teheran he fell off at the end of the year, but he gave us a really good couple months in 2023. Like the Brewers are very good at finding rotation help and building depth, and I just don't worry too much about it. But a Burns trade, which I think we could probably jump into right now, but I do think there's a decent chance the Brewers will still move Corbin Burns for kind of all the same reasons I just laid out. I think they're so good at finding starting pitching that can get you and keep you in games, that cashing in on a full year of Corbin Burns value could be worth the trade-off of what will be a drop-off in production from the starting pitching spot or rotation moving forward. So along those lines, where would you think the Brewers might look if they do decide to trade Burns, or at least become very open to trading Burns and they're taking calls and they're kind of searching out a trade? What kind of players are you looking for, or who do you think would be a good fit in terms of teams? Do you have anybody that you think would make sense?
Yeah, I think for us, we obviously look at the Western teams as far as the Dodgers make a lot of sense. For me, the type of package that I'm looking at is the Brewers tend to get guys who, yeah, top prospects, obviously, it's going to be a hefty price. When I was kind of breaking this down too, it's hindsight's 2020 at this point, but I almost wish we would have traded Burns last offseason now because it seemed a little bit like the price could have been a lot heftier if we had a guy trading with 2 years left on his deal versus one. And now with Woody, the news kind of hits even harder because now you're almost just putting yourself in a little bit bigger hole. Um, but yeah, I mean, like the Dodgers, like I said, and um, we obviously got a report too today that Mark Feinstein said that the Dodgers were trying to make or interested in making a deal for both Corbin and Willie in a package. Um, so what does that type of package look like? I mean, I think it's to me that's a hefty one. I value Willie probably more than the average person does. I think Willie is the type of guy who he always seems like he can break out randomly at one point. It just seems like we haven't fully gotten the Willie Adames experience. I
Yeah.
would not be shocked if like one year he just all of a sudden has 30 home runs and a 900 OPS and uh man, that would sting if it's like on the Dodgers or something in a big package. But if the package is big enough, then obviously I'd probably be okay with it. We don't have the greatest insurance at shortstop either. Obviously, we talked about guys like Eric Brown Jr., and I know you'll touch on him, or people probably point to Bryce Durang. Um, that's kind of where I get a little bit iffy is we don't necessarily have the greatest pathway to replace him immediately at least. Um, but a package for just Burns alone, I would kind of imagine obviously a very hefty package. Even with 1 year left in his deal, I'm sure somebody would want to be able to pencil him into their rotation. Adding Willie to that, I think the price would have to be very, very hefty, and that's kind of where I'm like, I probably wouldn't do it unless you're actually willing to give me a huge package, which I'm not sure somebody would. Um, but yeah, I mean, what do you think, obviously, in regards to Willie potentially getting tied into that? You're
Yeah.
the prospect guru, so you probably know a little bit more about what you'd want to see as far as a player goes. Maybe with the
Yeah.
Dodgers specifically too.
Right. So for for me, a Corbin Burns trade does not signal the Brewers planning to take a step back next year. If they were to trade both of them, I think that would signal them expecting to take at least a little bit of a step back in 2024. They will listen on anything, and we know that, and we've seen it in the past. They will listen on anybody and everybody if the price is right. The Dodgers do have the type of pieces that could potentially make that happen. Um, they've got a good mix of upper level minor league players and major league players that they would probably be willing to part with in a deal. So you could look at Emmett Sheehan or um, they've got a bunch of, I mean, borderline MLB starters already who are pretty young who could maybe help form that next group of guys that look like Woodruff and Burns and Freddie. They also have guys now. People might not like me saying this. I'm not the biggest Gavin Lux supporter or believer. I shouldn't say I support him. I don't believe that much in him. He just doesn't hit the ball that hard. He's a good athlete. He's from Wisconsin, so people like him. From what I've heard, very, very good person. So I'm not trying to knock him a ton, but like I've seen people saying, "Oh, he could headline a deal." Like, no, if he headlines the deal, I'm going to be very upset with that trade. Um, but they have other guys. I mean, Andy Pages is a really good bat in the upper minors. They've got Miguel Vargas, who's a good bat who is in the same spot. They could probably form a package that would be pretty interesting. I think the Orioles are another team that would probably now if the Orioles I'm looking at only for Burns. They're not trading for Adames. They have no reason to. They have Gunnar Henderson and Jackson Holiday both going to be able to play shortstop. They have no need for Adames at all. But if I'm looking for a Burns trade, that is who I am calling. If I'm shopping Burns, I'm calling the Orioles, and that's my first call, and I'm hoping it's my last call because they give me what I want. And what I want is Kobe Mayo as the headliner. I think he could step in and immediately be a middle of the order bat and play third base, and you could put Tyler Black at first base, and all of a sudden I feel really good about the corner infielders for a really long time. And Black could probably play some second base. You do have Brock Wilken kind of getting close, I think. I could see him coming up soon, so the corners could get crowded quick, but Kobe Mayo's ready for the majors, and he can mash. So I would love to see that. And I think it would make some sense because the Orioles have plenty of first base and third base depth. Mayo is kind of expendable for them, and they could use a guy who could be at the top of the rotation. So that's who I've been looking at. That's who I keep coming back to. There'd probably be some secondary pieces along with Mayo, and I could see like Dylan Beavers. He's a outfielder, good bat. I think the Brewers were tied to him a lot in the draft a couple years ago. They've got some interesting arms that are kind of more in the mid tier for prospects, but the Brewers do really good work with pitchers. So some guys with interesting traits. I'm sure they would try and include a few of those or a couple of those in a deal. But yeah, I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that I think they're going to trade Corbin Burns. It might not be till the deadline, but I just don't see him finishing the season as a Brewer and just leaving for the qualifying offer and the draft pick. I don't see that happening. I think that would be, the Brewers don't normally operate that way, and they don't normally want to lose people for nothing other than that pick. And I think with the way the market is, it's a bad starting pitching market for the free agent market. It just got worse when Aaron Nola returned to Philly. Teams are going to be desperate, and I think you could get a lot of value out of Burns at a time like this. So I think it's going to happen. And considering what Burns said in his recent interview with Foul Territory with our friend Eric Kratz and Todd Frazier and Scott Braun, I believe, were the three interviewing him that day, he kind of touched on what's happened the last few years. And naturally, Brewer fans weren't thrilled with some of the things he said, and it did paint the organization in not the best light at times. Corbin Burns is very good at speaking in a way that makes him sound better than he is, and other people sound worse than they are. And he said that, okay, yeah, I was kind of open to an extension a couple of years ago, which who knows? Why wouldn't you say that? You have nothing to lose by saying that right now. But at this point, I think the Brewers know that basically they can't afford me, and that this is just going to be the last year, and then we're going to go from there. So what most of us already knew was further clarified that he will not be signing an extension this year. If the Brewers came to him with some asinine offer of 12 years, $350 million, sure, he might consider that and take that deal. But there's no reason the Brewers would do that, and it's not going to happen. So he just confirmed what we already knew, and then threw out what he does a lot, which is kind of a shot at the Brewers in terms of saying, like, yeah, they might have missed their opportunity on extending me, which, whatever. To me, that interview just made it more likely that he does end up getting traded. And I don't think Burns is like a bad teammate or a guy who's like who's doing anything to sabotage the clubhouse or do anything like that. But I do think he's pretty bad at PR and knowing how to say things in a reasonable, like respectful way. He handled the arbitration case poorly last year, and he even admitted to that. I'll give him credit for that. He said, I learned a lot from that. I think this is more common than I thought it was, the way it was attacked. And he has learned a little bit about that stuff, and he did start taking a little bit more blame at the end of the season, which he has never been a big fan of doing either. Um, Corbin Burnes is a great pitcher. I would say losing Woodruff hurt me a lot, and losing Burnes in a trade is just going to be like most of the other deals I talked about, where it's just like, well, he had a good run here, and good luck wherever you go. But I will not miss Corbin Burnes like I'm going to be missing Brandon Woodruff. I will say that for sure. So, Gunnar, you got any other thoughts on Burnes or that interview he did with Foul Territory or anything along those lines?
That leads into perfectly what I was going to lead off with this part is I'm not sure I've ever really turned, and it's not like I don't like the guy, but I've never really
Yeah.
had sort of a 180 on my opinion of a player before, as much as him, because he's obviously a very, like you said, he's an all-star pitcher. Like there's no one really questioning that. I just haven't really appreciated all of his comments the last couple of years. It comes off sort of like you've alluded to it, but it's just like and he doesn't mean it like this, but it's just almost like he's like above the organization in a way.
Yeah.
And I'll try to keep my personal opinions out of it for the most part, but that's just kind of where
I did not do that.
yeah. uh, but I'll leave it at that as far as I just don't really, it just doesn't feel good with him anymore. I just kind of feel like the relationship between him and the organization has completely been cut off. Um, so to me, when people are shocked like we didn't offer him an extension, one, it doesn't make sense because we're not going to pay that much money for him, and then two, we don't have a great relationship anyways to begin with. Um, the money is obviously the bigger issue here. We would never really pay that much for a starting pitcher. It wouldn't really make sense.
Well, think
Um,
about Brandon Woodruff is a perfect example of why paying starting pitching is
yep.
extremely dangerous.
Oh, I
Like,
wouldn't do it either. Yeah.
yeah, it's a perfect example of why it's very, very dangerous to do, and the Brewers cannot afford to. I tweeted this during the week at some point, but I said I think the biggest advantage that big markets have over small markets is the ability to take risks on one. You can add a guy like David Price to a Mookie Betts trade to lower your cost. Like the Brewers can't
Hmm.
take 25 million in David Price money to not pitch. They can't do that in a trade just to help the rest of their prospect costs. They can't do it. And they can't afford to take risks on injuries. They can't because they cannot be paying $11 million to a guy who's not going to pitch that year. The Dodgers, that doesn't make a difference to them. It doesn't matter for them.
Hmm.
And that's why Corey Knebel and Jimmy Nelson both went to the Dodgers when they were in that situation. Like they can
Yeah.
take that risk. And I get that Brewer fans are frustrated. And I know people like Corbin Burnes as a pitcher. And when he is going right, he is extremely fun to watch. Like some of the best stuff I've ever seen from a starting pitcher. Corbin Burnes possesses that. But you also haven't been a Cy Young winner the last 2 years. You haven't been,
Right.
frankly, all that close. You've been a good pitcher the last 2 years, but you have not been a Cy Young winner like you were 2 years ago, or
Yep.
3 years ago now, and it feels like mentally he feels he's been the exact same way, the way he talks about himself, and that just kind of rubs me the wrong way. That's what I've always liked about Woodruff is that he's always been super humble and kind of he takes fault whenever anything happens, even if it's really not even his fault sometimes. And
Hmm.
Burnes is kind of the opposite, where it's like the only time he takes fault is if it's so clearly his fault that he has no other person he can possibly blame. And yeah, I don't know.
Right.
I'm definitely letting personal feelings seep into this conversation on this,
Oh,
but
I'm trying not to, but
I gave up on trying not to. I'm letting the world know. I've kept it quiet in tweets as much as I can, but everyone who
but
knows me knows I'm not a huge Birds fan at the moment, and I haven't been for a couple of years here. So
yeah, I
all
mean,
right.
just to end with though, you started to allude to it again, where he's talking as if he hasn't like regressed in a way these last couple of years since his Cy Young Award winning season. Um, and he's a guy who's gone down in strikeouts, gone up in walks, and then the last time we just saw him pitch, he didn't perform in the playoffs. So it's just like I'm not going to go to bat necessarily for a guy like that, where I'm just going to break the bank and take you back, and for all the reasons we just said why we wouldn't, I'm definitely not going to do it for a guy like that.
Right.
Um, and going back to what I said earlier, I kind of stole my later point, but man, I just wish we would have traded him last offseason where I just think the price tag for us could have been a lot higher. I think people would have paid that. He would have had come off a better year than he came off of this season. Um, I always wonder if people look at his pitching profile and be like, oh, we can just make this simple tweak and then he'll be good. Get for what we know of Corbin Burns, that's not going to happen. But
Yeah.
we
And that's
that's how we've been looking at it.
well, and that's another reason he's rubbed me the wrong way for so long is that
Yeah.
I am 100% certain that the Brewers know what they're doing when it comes to pitch mix tweaking and stuff. They would not be advising Corbin Burns to go out and throw 60% cutters every single outing when he has 4+ pitches that he can use. They wouldn't be doing that. They never would do that. And it showed all season. Whenever he would go to the slider more, he'd have his best games. But as soon as anything went wrong, it was like, nope, cutter, 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 constantly. And he's the most frustrating good Brewer I have ever had in my time here because I genuinely think he could have been like a 3-time Cy Young winner in a row with the stuff he has and the ability he has. And yes, I do think that the sticky stuff did play a role in his 2021 with his command. I don't think it was helping him that much with his movement and stuff. That hasn't changed that much, but I do think that he was getting the benefit of that when it came to command because that's what's really fallen back down a little bit. And that cutter is a great pitch, but if you are not commanding it perfectly like he did for almost all of 2021, teams can hit it. And like you said, we've seen it. We saw it in the playoffs. We've seen it in a lot of kind of big moments throughout the last few years. And when he's on, you can't touch him. But now you just go up there with that approach of, yeah, I'm looking for a cutter. You're probably going to get it. And eventually, when you're looking for a pitch as a major league hitter, you're going to hit it. So,
Mm.
yeah, we should probably move on from Burns before I have an aneurysm here. But um, no, if I will say this, if Corbin Burns comes back, I'm not going to like root against Corbin Burns. I want Corbin Burns to
No.
do really well for the Brewers. But if I had a preference, I would move on from Burns. And like you said, I would have liked them to move on from Burns in the past. So
Mhm.
now that my feelings are very well known by everyone listening, we can move on to the couple of transactions that did happen this week. The main one that probably got the most attention was the Brewers acquiring first baseman Jake Bauers. He plays some outfield as well, but I don't think you want him playing much outfield. They acquired him from the Yankees for outfield prospect Jace Avina and another younger outfield prospect, Brian Sanchez. This one, for me, wasn't my favorite move I've ever seen, but I think it's important to note that while Jace Avina is an interesting prospect and I do like him, and frankly, his family's been really cool to see interacting on Twitter and stuff. So he's a guy I was just rooting for in general. He seems like a really good kid and comes from a good family. So he'll be someone I'm rooting for with the Yankees organization, but it's a guy who has a lot of swing and miss concerns, not a huge hit tool, but he has huge power. He was 19 and he was already performing in full season ball. So the Brewers gave up a decent amount for a guy in Jake Bauers who on the surface looks like someone who has not much to offer. The thing is he hits the ball very hard, or he started hitting the ball very hard the last year or so with the Yankees. His hard hit rate was 48% this past season, which is very, very good. He tripled his barrel rate up to 18%, which is that would I think that may have led the Brewers if you were going strictly by barrel rate. And his exit velocity data has just been going up as well. So he made some adjustments. He kind of closed off his stance. Jack Stern tweeted out a picture kind of showing the changes, but he closed off his stance. He's got a little bit different hand placement, and it looks like it is making him more consistent and a little bit, it's doing a better job of him being able to get into his power. So the Brewers have been good at finding these types of guys and getting a good year or two out of them. Like you look back to even Jesus Aguilar. I mean, Eric Thames was a free agent, but it was a guy who was kind of under the radar. that was more money put into him. Obviously, there was a little bit more of an arms race to get Thames, but you could even just look at Rowdy Tellez. I mean, that was a pretty small trade that they made to bring in a guy who had a good year and a half or so with the Brewers. And yes, there's an element of like throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. And this is not guaranteeing Jake Bauers the starting first baseman spot, which I think some people might be confused about or thinking that might be the case. But it gives them an option, and the Brewers like to have depth, and they identified him as somebody who could potentially break out as a pretty big power threat. And not only that, but he kind of has post prospect hype. He was a big prospect at one point. He was part of a really big trade now, looking back on it, in terms of going from the Rays to the Guardians, and the Rays got Yandy Diaz back in that trade. So that did not work out for the Guardians at all, but he used to be a big prospect. The Brewers have done well with guys who were kind of post hype, like Jace Peterson is an example of that, a former top 100 prospect who broke out kind of late with the Brewers. And even you could look at Bryce Wilson on the pitching side, a guy who was a big prospect and had started to kind of fall out of favor. And all of a sudden he signs, or the Brewers make a cash trade for him last offseason, and he was a super important part of the bullpen. So the Brewers have kind of deserved the benefit of the doubt, in my opinion, on these types of things. They have done a good job of finding players like this, identifying players like this, and putting them in a position where they can succeed. So, Gunnar, did you have any thoughts on that particular deal? I don't know how much you were able to look into Bauers or anything, but I know you're our swing guy. I don't know if you looked at his swing recently.
That was actually my first note is I want to say he had like a warning track bomb against us when we played the Yankees. And I remember thinking to myself, like, that guy's got a nice swing.
Well,
Um,
there we go.
uh, so maybe he's a guy we want. But for me, I look at it like this is more of a Rowdy Tellez replacement, in my opinion. It's not a guy who you're necessarily looking to fill in, like you said, at first base for sure. Like he's going to be our starting first baseman all the time. Um, I like you did. I looked a little deeper into his season last year. I had the same numbers you had pulled up as far as his hard hit rate, barrel percentage, all that. He has a good arm actually, but he's horrible at defense, so it doesn't really provide
Yeah.
us with much. uh, Maybe he can just fire people out at home plate from the cutoff. Uh, but no, like I said, he has a nice swing. Um, and as far as the Roddy replacement goes, Roddy would have been a little bit more expensive, I believe, too, in a
Oh yeah,
way.
probably four
Uh,
times
yeah,
what Bowers is going to get. So
and you don't love either of them necessarily, so um, I'll take a chance on a guy like that, and who's just cheaper and probably would give you close to what Roddy would give you.
and
Um,
similar upside.
yeah, and like I said, looking deeper into it too, he was a guy who was strictly against righties for the most part. He was platooning like that. So, and when he was hitting righties, I think it was like a 720 OPS, which is probably pretty close to league average, which isn't great or anything, but maybe we got something there. And like you said, the power uptick was there, which I enjoy a lot because the Brewers obviously need some power. So worst case, it's a flyer in that aspect, and maybe you can hit and use them and maybe trade them, whatever the case may be. But Jay Savina, like you said, a guy you opened me up to last year and were sending me videos and very excited. It's me being the swing guru. You said that this guy is
Yep.
he qualifies, and he did. And what's was funny too, last podcast, I think we had a question of like who is like your sleeper prospect in the system, and if you guys would have swung it to me, which I was fine with because you guys are the prospect guys, uh, I was going to say Jay Savina, honestly, if he tossed it to me, uh, just obviously all based off of you, and then you, like I said, you sending it to me and everything, and me looking into him, and he did have a fun swing, and um, but like I said, people get caught up in the numbers a lot of the times too. Of like we traded two top 30 prospects for Jake Bauers. What the hell are we doing? But um, I just think it's a low risk, high reward type of situation. I'm just not that concerned about if Jake Bauers flames out. I don't think it's going to ruin our season very much, and
Yeah.
the chances of Jay Savina being something incredible are probably semi low-ish. But
Yeah.
we obviously like him a lot too, so it sucks. But these are just trades you sometimes have to make. And like I said, this is more just filling that Rowdy Tellez void, not trying to fill the first base void. And that's the answer to all of our questions at first base.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I pointed this out on Twitter too, but it's important to remember that because the Brewers have built up very, very good minor league depth, that guys that they trade are probably going to sound more noticeable or sound more notable and be more like
True.
you've heard about them more than you might have in the past because the Brewers mid-range prospects are better than they used to be. So now the guys that they end up moving in trades sound more like big names, but really they're still pretty far down in the pecking order compared to what they have at the top of the organization, which used to
Yeah.
be these types of guys. Like Hendry Mendez was at best a top 30-ish prospect. And if you went back even 4 or 5 years, you could make an argument that he would have been like top 10 in the Brewers system. So
Mm-hmm.
the depth changing has made it seem worse to give up a top 30 prospect than it used to be, but or that like these names you recognize more because they've had some people talk about them. That's just a product of the depth. And when you have a lot of good depth, you are a little more willing to move it in a deal that you find reasonable. So if you look at the Rays, they do it all the time. They'll trade a
Mm-hmm.
guy who's like their number 15 prospect for some random guy that you haven't heard of, and suddenly that guy's mashing against lefties for a year and helping them on the team. And it's just
Yeah.
teams who have good prospect depth are going to end up trading players and it kind of sucks. And especially for someone like me who does follow it super closely, who has like all these guys that I get way too excited about, more excited than I should be. Um, when a name like that pops up, I'm like, oh, really? We gave up Jay Savina for Bauers, but then when you kind of sit back and
Mm-hmm.
think about it, it's like, I mean, they probably have three other guys who can be kind of comparable to Jay Savina, and
Right.
the Yankees picked him, and the Brewers were like, all right, well, we still have all these other options that we can use, or that we still will be keeping in the system, so we can afford to give up somebody along those lines. So it's different than it used to be for the Brewers because of that depth. You
Mm-hmm.
might see names that you like getting moved more often, and that's just part of it. The other trade they made, which we actually did kind of cover a little bit on the podcast with Jack, was the Chad Patrick. They got him from the A's, right-handed pitcher from the A's for Abraham Toro, who they were going to end up non-tendering. So I talked about Patrick on that pod, but he's 92 to 94 with the fastball. Um, Kind of a slider slash cutter type pitch that actually got pretty good results in AAA, like a 36% whiff rate. And that's the pitch he commands super well. So I kind of wonder if they're going to go like a Hunter Strickland type of approach to his pitching where he throws a ton of slider, cutter, whatever you want to call it. And then the fastball is more the change of pace because of the way he can command that off speed pitch. So nothing super exciting there, but another arm that they can add as a possibility. And you never know what can happen when the Brewers get their hands on a guy that they like and an arm that they like. So that kind of leads us into a question we got on Twitter from Patrick. He was just kind of asking who are some potential trade candidates for the Brewers to target, probably thinking more along the lines of major league talent. But Gunnar, did you have anybody you found that seemed like that would be a good fit for the Brewers and probably make some sense?
Mm-hmm. So we know the holes that the Brewers have. Obviously, third base has been more of a sore spot the last few years, trying to figure out who would play that spot. We thought we had it with Luis Urias. That did not work out. And I think a name that, looking through some of the names that we saw, um, just being linked to potentially trades, one we saw pretty early in this offseason was Jonathan India, of the Cincinnati Reds. He would be okay for me, but the problem with that one is the price would probably be pretty high, given that he is in the division. Um, and looking more deep into him as far as his barrel percentage, all that stuff, hard hit rate, he's just kind of average. He's not like not what I really thought he was. Um, but I would take him. But like I said, I don't know if I want to pay that price. And for a guy like that, I'm not sure that I get super excited about him. The one I would be more excited about that I found was Jorge Polanco, of the Twins. A guy who I've actually liked for a few years now. Always very solid. above average league hitter. Can handle third and second. Probably a little short too. I don't know if he is great there, but
Yeah, and a
uh,
pinch maybe.
yeah. So I mean, a guy that you can move around a little bit, which kind of fits the Brewers mold type of player. Um, but just kind of a guy, you know what you're getting in offense. He's been very consistent over his career, so I would be interested in doing that. It looks like he has some potential injury concerns the last few years, but the price to me would probably be a little bit lower than like a Jonathan India. But how about you? Do you have any names that you liked as well?
Yeah, I did. So I was looking at MLB trade rumors. They put out a top 25 offseason trade candidates, and both the guys you listed there were on that list. So one of the ones they brought up was the Mariners. They just called it Mariners starting pitcher. So they said they were going to put a few different names, and they were like, well, I think the Mariners are just going to move one of these guys. They are in need of some offense, and they have some young pitching that would be pretty interesting, I think, to the Brewers as they kind of have to fill out a new rotation moving forward, given the Woodruff news. And like we talked about with Burns, either being here for this year or not being here for this year, but he's not going to be here in the future. We don't know what's going on with Aaron Ashby. You're hopeful that he can come back and help, but he's another shoulder injury, so you never know what you're going to get there. And then Hauser's getting up there in arbitration. I think he has one more year after this year, or this is the last year. I'm not 100% sure on that, but Colin Ray's not exactly a long-term guy. So you got Robert Gasser and you got Jacob Mizorowski and Carlos Rodriguez and guys like that. But it'd be nice to have a young guy who's already kind of in the major leagues. And the Mariners have a few guys who could fit that role. So the article mentioned Brian Wu, Bryce Miller, or Emerson Hancock. They did say that George Kirby would almost certainly not be included, and that is understandable, and that it would take a ton to pry away Logan Gilbert as well, who, yeah, I wouldn't expect Kirby or Gilbert to move unless there's some sort of huge deal on the table. But the other three, I would be curious if they would be interested in a swap. The Brewers might have to add on to this, but someone like Joey Weimer or even Mitchell. I don't think Terang would be appealing to them as an offensive player, but perhaps Frelick is on the table in that type of trade because it is another young player you'd be getting back. I do think that would be an interesting matchup between the two teams of somebody like, okay, the Brewers have all this outfield depth at the upper levels. We have all this pitching depth. We kind of need some offense. The Brewers need some younger pitching. I could see that working out. I don't know the specifics of which one. I mean, they're all fun arms. I would not be opposed to adding any of those three that I listed. So that one stood out to me as a pretty fun possibility. And then some of the other ones they listed were more along the lines of they had a bunch of others of note. And one that just stood out to me was the Red Sox, Nick Pivetta. He's been a guy I've always really liked his arm. He hasn't really put up the counting results that you would hope for, I guess. His ERA has been around 4-ish. But this past year, he struck out way more, like, I think it was around 10 per nine, if not a little more. His walk numbers were very reasonable. He's the type of guy I feel like is about to kind of like you mentioned with Willy Adames, where you think, okay, the breakout could happen any moment here where he really takes off. I kind of see that with Pivetta on the mound. So he's somebody that I'd be super interested in. The bats that were listed in here, you touched on the two that I would have also been interested in. Harold Ramirez, the Rays, he's always interested me. He doesn't really have a real defensive spot, which for the Brewers, that's not usually the best fit, but he hits the ball hard. He's got pretty decent speed on top of that. And he kind of just seems like somebody who's on the verge of having a really big offensive season, but he's somebody I could see them matching up with because they do like to trade with the Rays. It seems like they have a good relationship there, and they seem to be in the market for an arm. Always, they're always looking for arms. The Brewers kind of have some to offer in that regard, and yeah, I could see them matching up a little bit. I know, Patrick, you were also asking about the possibility of Christopher Morel. Gunnar and I were talking about that a little bit beforehand just to see what we thought. But Patrick said if the Cubs move Christopher Morel, could the Brewers swoop in potentially? He's cheap, he's young, but he's not very good defensively. Do you think the Brewers would take his offense in place of that? So we talked about a Gunnar. I think, like you mentioned with Jonathan India, the interdivisional trades are going to bring more cost than you would normally want. Um, he is cheap, and the bat is pretty interesting. I mean, there's swing and miss for sure. There's a lot of swing and miss concern. I could 100% see a future where he's taking the Javi Baez route, where all of a sudden the bat falls off a cliff because he just cannot stop chasing. But there's also a really big potential with the bat. He doesn't really have a defensive spot like these other guys. So do you think it's possible that they would make a trade for him, or at least make an attempt to go after him?
Uh, Funny enough, I was just looking at the names too, and he kind of fits in the same type of mold. I don't think the Brewers necessarily love guys who are just strictly DH type of guys with no defense. And while I was saying funny enough, I forgot the name Eloy Jimenez
Oh, yeah.
on the White Sox, who I think would obviously fill a void offensively because he provides some power. Granted, he's been hurt a few years, but last year's actually more healthy than he's normally been. And he's controllable too, which would be a positive for us. But just as far as that mold for like what Brewers like, he just doesn't provide a lot of flexibility for you, which I think Christopher kind of does that same type of thing. And I just don't think it's very realistic, especially right now with the Cubs. I don't know if we're going to be open for business for a while. So, um, and especially for a guy like that. And then at that point, I don't think we're very open for business if we're not talking about guys who they don't like and we don't really like. So,
Yeah.
um, just if we actually value somebody, they're probably going to be raising an eyebrow, like, why are we giving him to the Brewers if they see something in him? So,
Right.
yeah, I think it's just tough. But Eloy, like I said, I forgot to mention, I think that he would actually fit the mold a little bit, but the same type of conversation where DH only is pretty tough.
Yeah. Yeah. And Eloy's contract, well, like you said, it is controllable. It does start getting a little expensive with those team options with 16 and a half and then 18 and a half million for 2 years. The next 2 years after, I think he's controlled for just next season before those team options kick in. So he his bat, like the idea of his bat could be huge in the middle of the Brewers lineup, but like you said, and like we've seen, the Brewers don't really use the DH that way. They like to give Yelich time off from the outfield and Contreras time off from behind the plate, and whoever their backup first baseman is a chance to play first. Well, that guy gets a DH spotter. They use it more as a way to get guys off their feet, but keep them in the lineup. And so just trading for a straight DH would be a divergent from that, I guess. But you never know. I mean, I guess I
It
don't
is
know
the
how
Pat Murphy era.
I was just going to say, you don't know how Pat Murphy wants to handle that. He may say, I want guys to get straight rest instead of DHing on days that they're kind of resting.
Yeah.
So who knows? But my guess would still be that they would kind of shy away from those DH only bats, like you were saying. And then Patrick also asked, quality infield depth still a priority given the Adames and Terang future. So we kind of touched on Willie, but Terang, I don't think many people believe in Terang at the moment as somebody who could actually be a trusted starter for the Brewers. I could see him being a utility guy. I don't think the bat is ever going to be good enough to really want him in your lineup every day. So yeah, I do think that that's going to be a priority for them moving forward. I think, like I said, I do like Eric Brown Jr. There has been some reports lately that our scouts have been souring on him quite a bit, and mostly because the bad ball data has not been great. He did go there to the Arizona Fall League, and it seemed like he made an adjustment to get into his legs more. So some of that power he had in college might be it wouldn't shock me to see it kind of show up again next year. But if it doesn't, then yeah, he could end up looking a lot like Terang, where it's a defense only, speed only profile, and then you're kind of in the same spot. So I'm guessing that yeah, they're trying to find another shortstop or somebody who can handle shortstop with a better bat this offseason. But those are kind of in high demand around the league too, so it's not the easiest thing to find. Um, yeah, I'm sure they're looking for it, but it's going to be hard to go out and find it. Gunnar, you got any thoughts on either of those two?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised how much I didn't like Trang by the end of it last season. I was kind of excited for him to begin with, and I knew the defense would be there. Probably not even that good of defense. I didn't even expect. I knew he's obviously very good at defense, but I didn't really. And going to second base from shortstop, I probably should have figured that it's going to be. It's not necessarily easier, as you know, but it's
It's
in
easier.
that. Yeah, in the major leagues, it's probably a little bit easier. He'd probably even say, but he obviously was great that way. But offensively, not to give Jack Stern more props, but I think he posted another um tidbit where he was like the second worst hitter like against fastballs or something. He was like the second
Yeah,
worst qualified person against like a specific pitch. I think like Tim Anderson was only worse than him, but
yeah,
I saw that today and I was just like, yeah, that matches the eye test. And he's just uh Jack might have even said this too, but I was thinking it for a while, is he just has a very long swing and it's very like
yeah,
just it doesn't really have much life. Like it's just you're not catching up to anything at the major league level doing that. But yeah, I was very not excited to watch him this season, and I would not be uh too upset if I didn't have to watch him anymore.
yeah,
Um, Talking about the Dunn conversation last year, that's why I was a little more excited for Dunn, and hopefully he can maybe take that spot too, which might add to the infield depth as well. Um, do you think the Brewers can afford to lose Willie? Because I've obviously touched on that before. I don't think we can, just offensively too. But
yeah,
yeah, you kind of laid out how tough it is at short right now. So
yeah. And that's the thing. He probably is going to be in really high demand if he's at all available because the shortstop market in the free agency is god awful this year. I mean,
yeah,
it's Tim Anderson and Brandon Crawford, and Crawford might have retired. I don't even know, but those are the type of guys that are out there on the market. So Willie being available in a trade would net a huge return, I would imagine. But like I said earlier, I think a Burns trade you can get past and still compete this year. I don't think you can with Willie for the reasons I kind of just laid out. So
and we said it too. We talked about the word rebuild a lot, and we talked about it off camera too. But that would very much signal this is a we're kind of in a
at
way
least
punting this season.
yeah, at least a retool year. Like I don't think it would
Yeah,
yeah, I don't think it would set them into this huge rebuild, but I think it would be hard to say that yeah, we're competing in 2024 without Willie Adames being part of that
yeah.
roster. It would just be hard for me to see it. Um, Kind of speaking about the rest of the roster and some other moves that happened, we kind of touched on Rowdy Tellez being non-tendered. We touched on why Jake Bauers made sense then to come in and kind of take that role for a quarter of the price. That's why Rowdy got non-tendered. Rowdy had a really good year and a half or so with the Brewers. A really good dude, guy who got the last out to clinch a playoff spot this year on the mound, which was a great moment. But he just did not hit this year, so sucks to see him go. But wouldn't shock me to see him end up somewhere else and kind of pick it back up with the bat. But he is gone. Our resident PED user, JC Mejia, got uh, non-tendered as well. He was on suspension number 2 for PEDs, which meant he was out for the whole season anyway. There's no way they're going to keep him under contract and have to worry about 40-man spots and all that stuff all off season. So that was a given. And then Eric Lauer was DFA'd. We didn't really touch on it at any other point in the other pod, but he was DFA'd earlier in the offseason. He cleared waivers. He's out there on the open market already. Um, Another guy who had kind of a good half a year-ish, but kind of felt like smoke and mirrors. And Jack Stern, again, was always all over that and made it pretty clear that, like, yeah, he's throwing fastballs right down the middle, and I don't understand why they're not getting hit. And then they started getting hit, and he fell apart. So I guess another guy you could include in like the loss of starting pitching depth that they had the last couple of years, but frankly, the guy we had last year wasn't really helpful at all as starting pitching depth anyway. So then to just touch on a couple other moves they made, they signed right-handed pitcher Anoli Paredes to a minor league deal, left-handed pitcher Jared Koenig, I want to say, and utility infielder Yanni Hernandez to minor league deals. So I looked into Paredes a decent amount. He's had some major league experience with the Astros. He's kind of a mid 90s fastball, really high spin rate slider. He's got a 3.05 ERA at the major league level, and it's only like 25, 30 innings or something. But he's an interesting guy. He walks a few too many, probably, but the Brewers have had success with guys like him. He's only 27, so still something there. And like I said, I think it's a good mix in the fastball slider range. Koenig seems kind of interesting. He's been a starter. He's got 5 pitches, but he hasn't had he got demoted from AAA to AA last year. I think it's just something where they saw a couple pitches they're interested in, and they're going to try and build on that with him. And then Yanni Hernandez, he's been in the majors for the last 3 years, different parts of the season, with the Diamondbacks and the Rangers. He's a glove first guy who has good bat to ball skills and like plate discipline, but he doesn't pack much of a punch. He's probably just going to be like the type of guy you want to have at AAA as depth, where he's apparently a very good clubhouse guy. Like, people really like having him around, but
The Abraham Toro.
yeah, but Toro could hit.
Yeah,
He can't even hit. It's he
that
fills
type
a
of
bunch.
depth though.
Yeah, he can play a bunch of positions and help out and be a good clubhouse guy, and that is super important at AAA. Like, I'm not trying to diminish what he is as a player, but if we see him in the majors next year, that's probably not a very good thing. So, Gunnar, you got anything else you want to touch on quick before we wrap this one up?
No, I mean you obviously know pitchers more than me. I would just say that if the Brewers are probably signing the guy, they probably like specifically something about each one of them. They could probably do their little Brewers magic and make them into somebody that they're going to be in high leverage situations probably somehow. But yeah, I mean it's just always interesting when you see us sign guys like that, because you know that they see something in them, and that's obviously when you come in and you try to find out what it is. But Eric Lauer I never really enjoyed, so at
Yeah.
least recently, so I wasn't very sad to see that. That's probably why we forgot about it. But yeah,
Yeah. But
that's
yeah,
it.
I mean, along the lines of what you're saying, like, there really is, I've said this a lot over the years, like, there is no such thing as a bad minor league deal. There's no risk. And if you like something in them, you put them on your roster, you try and work with them. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. So they take this chance on these guys, they give them a shot. And if Paredes can't stop walking people, or Koenig just keeps getting hit like he did in AAA, they'll cut him at some point next year, and it's no harm, no foul. But sometimes they find a guy like Wade Miley on a minor league deal, or even just Andrew Monasterio was a minor league free agent 2 years ago. So those guys can end up helping. Yeah, but I guess that's all we got for this Brewers episode. So if you are listening, please like and subscribe on whatever platform you are on. And like we always say, feel free to leave us feedback. We love to hear that on how we can get better. And thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.